After the end of the Civil War in 1865, Southern plantations replaced slave labor with the also flawed sharecropping and tenant farming system. Each system involved 4 farm laborers that would work on land that usually belonged to white landowners. The sharecropper or tenant farmer would plow, plant, weed, and harvest the fields, and then share a certain percentage of the crop yield with the landowner. The main difference between the two systems is that in sharecropping system, money for equipment and seed was usually supplied by the landowner, whereas tenant farmers purchased these themselves. Once freed from slavery, many newly freed men left the southern plantations and farms to travel to cities and shanty towns. Many others chose to search for family members that had been previously sold away. These rumors went around, such as 40 acres and a mule, that the freedmen would receive land from the government that were confiscated after the war. But once it was clear that they were false, they had to make other plans.
In the aftermath of the Civil War, many freedmen and many poverty-stricken whites had to get support from the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was in charge of overseeing former slaves' transition into free labor. Around this time, the agricultural economy was also suffering. In some cotton farming areas, many fields were not being used since nearly 10% of the black population declined in those areas. Due to this, the value of farmland dropped and the agricultural economy became almost non-existent. In order to fix the southern agricultural industry that had been decimated by the war, a new labor system needed to be put into place. Freedmen were urged to return to areas around their rural beginnings in order to become paid plantation workers by the Freedmen's Bureau, who would help create contracts between them and landowners. At first, they had developed what was called the wage system, where freed people would live in old slave quarters and work for money in gangs like they had used to. This system failed to work mostly because the freedmen refused to work in these gangs or live in the former slave housing. Another reason it had failed to work was because the landowners no longer had any money to pay workers, since currency was in short supply after the war and any Confederate currency was considered worthless. Since the banking system was in shambles, landowners were also unable to borrow any money to pay workers. Landowners also no longer held the power to enforce the same kind of labor on their former slaves that they had wanted. Even so, freedmen were still driven back to field work by necessity on terms short of those that they had hoped for. The wage system may have failed, but 2 things were still apparent. Most agricultural resources still belonged to white landowners, but on the other hand, the freedmen had the resource of labor that gave them some forms of power in deciding the conditions they would work under. This is when sharecropping came to solve the farm labor issue. Although the system meant white landowners still had power over blacks and poor whites, it gave poor whites a way out of an insufficient life, and it gave blacks some semblance of the independence that they had strived for. At first, the freedmen's conditions were actually improved by the sharecropping system. In some instances, sharecroppers were allowed to raise chickens and pigs, use the forest to fish, hunt, and gather wood, which allowed them to benefit from their own labor.
Over time, many problems arose with the sharecropping system that led to widespread poverty and debt. Since landowners usually supplied the seed, fertilizer, tools, animals, and other necessities in advance, sharecroppers would already begin their jobs in debt. Many times, the property owners or a neighboring merchant would have some form of a store where the sharecropper could get basic necessities like food and clothing to keep their families alive until the harvest. In order to afford these goods, portions of that year's harvest would often serve as collateral, or the merchants would keep track of yearly debts and subtract that from the laborer's share of the crop. Sharecroppers faced many other problems as well. Since many sharecroppers were still illiterate, they would not have been able to argue with landowners as to how much they had made throughout the year. According to Minnie Whitney, the daughter of a sharecropper, no matter what the owners said you earned, you would have to take their word for it. Henry Blake, a former slave that became a sharecropper, said that even if you could count and keep good record, you would still have to, quote, take the white man's work on note. Even if they did figure out that they were being lied to about the amount they had made, there was not much that could be done without punishment. In an interview, Hughes Childs described a situation where a man he knew attempted to withhold some of the crop from the landlord and in turn was drawn by horse through the streets and hung when he was caught. Many would find problems if they attempted to leave their jobs. In a letter describing why he left the South, John Solomon Lewis wrote that after being forced to continue work in order to pay off the previous year's debt, He told the landowner that he was going to leave and try to make a living like a working white man, to which the property owner threatened to shoot his head off. In some cases, sharecroppers would be forced to work for free in order to pay off previous debts. In an autobiography by an unnamed sharecropper that goes by a Georgia Negro Peon, the author describes his life as a sharecropper and how he ended up in a convict camp. After forming many one-year contracts with the landlord, he was convinced to sign a contract for 10 years. Soon after, the owner had begun to build a convict camp for prisoners leased from the state of Georgia. After dealing with unfavorable conditions for 10 years, he and others decided to not renew these contracts. At this time, many freedmen could not read, so when he and many other free laborers signed an acknowledgement of their debts, they had no idea that they had actually agreed to continue working off their debts and to be put in the convict stockades as the employer saw fit. They also could not legally break their contracts, no matter the reason, or be hired by another employer. If they had attempted to run away, they could be, quote, run down by bloodhounds, arrested without process of law, and be returned to our employer, who could be or give any other kind of punishment seen fit. In this case, he had essentially consented to terms similar to that of slavery.
In order to replace plantation slave labor, the sharecropping and tenant farming systems became popularized in the post-Civil War South. Although it did give former slaves more freedom than they previously had, the continuous debt cycles, wage bondage, and racism ended up causing them a lot of problems and suffering.